The research station, Horizon's Edge, hung in the darkness of space like a silver needle, orbiting the green jungle world below. Kethrevi stood at the front of the briefing room, his four arms folded across his chest as he watched the new team settle into their seats. He was a Selthari, a species known for their iridescent scales that shifted colors with their moods, and right now those scales were a deep, worried blue. "Welcome to Velathos Prime," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many young researchers make deadly mistakes. The room held 12 beings from across the galaxy. There was a pair of Morvathi engineers with their long, flexible necks, a Kelix botanist whose fur rippled like grass in wind, 3 Yanari geologists who moved as one unit, and several others whose species Kethrevi had worked with many times before. And then there was the human. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat near the back of the room, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her attention seemingly fixed on the viewport behind Kethrevi rather than on him. He had heard stories about humans. Every species in the galaxy had heard stories about humans. They were the newcomers to galactic civilization, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago, and in that short time, they had built a reputation that made senior researchers nervous. "Before we descend to the surface tomorrow," Kethrevi continued, "I need to make certain things absolutely clear." He pressed a button on his console, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the room. The creature displayed was roughly the size of a small domestic animal, with 6 delicate wings that seemed to glow from within, a sleek body covered in soft-looking fur, and large dark eyes that reflected light like pools of ink. Several researchers leaned forward with interest. The human woman actually smiled. "This," Kethrevi said gravely, "is the Venomous glider." He let the name hang in the air for a moment. "It is considered the most dangerous small predator on Velathos Prime, and possibly in this entire sector of the galaxy." The Kelix botanist raised a paw, her fur standing on end with concern. "How dangerous exactly?" "1 drop of its venom can paralyze a Selthari in 4 seconds, Kethrevi answered, watching the fear spread across the faces before him. "Death follows within 3 minutes, and there is no known antidote that works fast enough to save the victim." He noticed that the human was still smiling, her eyes fixed on the holographic glider as if it were the most wonderful thing she had ever seen. His scales flickered to an anxious orange. "The glider's venom is effective against every known species in the Galactic Union," he continued, speaking a little louder to make sure the human heard him. "They are territorial, unpredictable, and show no fear of larger creatures." "They are very pretty," the human said suddenly, her voice warm with admiration. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Kethrevi felt his scales shift to a pale yellow of disbelief. "Dr. Vasquez," he said carefully, "did you hear what I just said about the venom?" "Oh yes," Elena replied cheerfully. "Paralysis in seconds, death in minutes, very scary." She tilted her head, still gazing at the hologram. "But look at those little wings, and their eyes are so big and sweet." The Morvathi engineers exchanged nervous glances. One of the Yanari geologists made a sound that might have been a prayer to their ancestors. Kethrevi took a deep breath and reminded himself that humans were not stupid, despite what their behavior sometimes suggested. They had built starships and cured diseases, and survived a world that had tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways. There had to be some reason they acted like this. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, keeping his voice calm and professional, "I need you to understand the rules we follow when dealing with venomous gliders." Elena finally looked away from the hologram and met his eyes. "Of course," she said, "I am listening. Under no circumstances are you to touch a glider." "Understood. You are not to approach within 10 meters of a glider." "Got it. You are not to make direct eye contact with a glider, as they interpret this as a challenge." "Makes sense." If you see a glider, you are to slowly back away and alert the rest of the team immediately. Absolutely. Kethrevi studied her face for any sign of deception or foolishness, but the human seemed completely sincere. Her expression was serious, her posture attentive. Perhaps he had misjudged her. Perhaps the stories about humans were exaggerated. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. Alina nodded and pointed at the viewport behind him, where the green canopy of Velathos Prime stretched out like an endless ocean below the station. "The pretty glowing ones down there in the trees," she said, her voice curious and light, "are those gliders? How close is too close to watch them from here?" Kethrevi turned to look at the viewport. In the jungle canopy far below, dozens of tiny lights moved through the darkness of the approaching night, their bioluminescence creating patterns like floating stars among the leaves. "Those are indeed gliders," he confirmed, "and watching from the station is perfectly safe." "Oh good," Alina said happily, "because they are absolutely beautiful and I could watch them for hours." She pulled out a small notebook and began sketching something, her hand moving quickly across the paper. Kethrevi watched her for a moment, feeling his scales slowly return to their normal calm green. Perhaps everything would be fine after all. The human seemed to understand the rules, and she had agreed to follow them without argument. He continued the briefing, covering the other dangerous species on Velathos Prime, the emergency protocols, the communication procedures, and all the other vital information the team would need. When he finished 2 hours later, the researchers filed out of the room one by one, heading to their quarters to rest before tomorrow's descent. Alina was the last to leave, and she paused at the door to look back at him. "Thank you for the briefing," she said politely. "I learned so much today." Then she glanced at the viewport one more time, her eyes finding those distant glowing lights in the jungle below. Something in her smile made Kethrevi's scales flicker with unease. "Dr. Vasquez," he called out as she turned to leave, "please remember what I said about the gliders." "Oh, I will remember everything," Alina promised. She walked out the door with her notebook clutched to her chest and a strange, dreamy look in her eyes. Kethrevi stood alone in the empty briefing room, staring at the holographic glider still rotating slowly in the air before him. He had a bad feeling about this mission. He had a very bad feeling indeed. The jungle of Velathos Prime was everything the briefings had promised, and more. Massive trees rose toward the sky like ancient pillars, their trunks wider than spacecraft and their canopy so thick that only scattered beams of green-tinted light reached the forest floor. Strange sounds echoed through the humid air, calls and cries from creatures that no one on the team had ever seen in person. On the third day of the expedition, the research team had finally finished setting up their base camp in a small clearing near a freshwater stream. Kethrevi supervised the final placement of the sensor equipment, his 4 arms working efficiently as he checked connections and calibrated devices. "The perimeter sensors are active," announced one of the Morvathi engineers, her long neck swaying with satisfaction. "We will receive warnings if anything dangerous approaches." "Excellent work," Kethrevi replied, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. The camp was secure. The equipment was functioning. Perhaps this mission would proceed without any disasters after all. He looked around the clearing, counting heads as he had done every hour since they landed. The Morvathi were at the communication station. The Yanari geologists were examining rock samples near the stream. The Kelix botanist was cataloging plant specimens at the edge of the tree line. But where was the human? Kethrevi's scales immediately shifted to bright orange with alarm. "Has anyone seen Dr. Vasquez?" he called out. The other researchers looked up from their work, confusion on their faces. "She was here just a moment ago," the Kelix said, her fur rippling with concern. "She said she wanted to look at some flowers." "Which direction did she go?" The Kelix pointed toward the dense jungle to the east, where the shadows grew thick and the bioluminescent plants had begun to glow in the dimming light. Kethrevi grabbed his emergency kit and started moving. "Everyone stay here," he ordered. "I will find her." He pushed through the undergrowth, his heart's pounding in his chest as he scanned the forest for any sign of the human. The plants here grew in strange, twisted shapes, their leaves dripping with moisture, their stems covered in thorns that could cut through standard protective gear. "Dr. Vasquez," he shouted Alina. No response. He moved faster, ducking under low branches and stepping over roots that seemed to reach for his feet. The forest was getting darker now, the sunlight fading as evening approached, and the bioluminescent plants were coming alive all around him. And then he saw the glow. Not the soft blue of the plants, but a brighter, warmer light. Orange and gold and pink, shifting and swirling like living fire. Kethrevi's blood ran cold. He knew that glow. He crept forward as quietly as he could, pushing aside a curtain of hanging vines, and found himself looking into a small clearing bathed in that beautiful, terrible light. Alina sat on a moss-covered rock in the center of the clearing, her legs crossed beneath her, her face peaceful and content. 3 venomous gliders surrounded her. One was perched on her left shoulder, its 6 wings folded against its body, its small head pressed against her neck. Another sat in her lap, curled up like a sleeping pet, its eyes half closed with pleasure. The third was on her right shoulder, and Alina was scratching it under its chin with her fingers, making soft cooing sounds as if she were talking to a baby. Kethrevi could not move. He could not breathe. He could not think. The glider's venom sacs were clearly visible, full and swollen with enough poison to kill everyone in the camp 20 times over. Their wings twitched occasionally, and their dark eyes reflected the light of their own bioluminescence. They were the most deadly small creatures on the planet, and they were sitting on a human like she was their favorite perch. Alina looked up and saw Kethrevi standing at the edge of the clearing. Her face broke into a bright smile. "Oh, hello," she said cheerfully, keeping her voice soft and gentle. "Come look, they are so friendly." Kethrevi tried to speak, but no sound came out. His scales had gone completely white, the color of pure terror. "Do not move," he finally managed to whisper. "Please, Dr. Vasquez, do not move a single muscle." Alina laughed quietly, and the sound made the glider in her lap lift its head with curiosity. "Why would I move?" she asked. "We are having such a nice time together." She returned her attention to the glider she had been scratching, finding a spot behind its ear membrane that made the creature let out a strange, rumbling sound. A 4th glider dropped from the branches above and landed on top of Alina's head. Kethrevi made a strangled noise of horror. "This one is my favorite so far," Alina announced, reaching up to stroke the new arrival with her free hand. "She has been following me since yesterday." "Following you," Kethrevi repeated weakly, "since yesterday." "Yes, I saw her watching me from the trees, and she looked so curious, so I held out my hand to show her I was friendly." Alina scratched the glider's belly, and it made that rumbling sound again. "She sniffed me for a while, and then she let me pet her, and now she follows me everywhere." Kethrevi felt like he might faint. His vision was getting blurry at the edges, and his 4 hearts were beating so fast he thought they might explode. "The venom," he said desperately, "they could kill you in seconds." "Oh, I know," Alina said calmly. "You mentioned that in the briefing." "Then why are you touching them?" Alina looked at him with genuine confusion, as if he had asked her why water was wet or why stars were bright. "Because they wanted to be touched," she said simply. "They came to me, not the other way around." The glider on her left shoulder lifted its head and made a soft chirping sound. Alina chirped back, mimicking the noise with surprising accuracy. The creature responded with a longer series of chirps, and then it pressed its face against Alina's cheek, in what could only be described as a nuzzle. "See," Alina said proudly, "they like me." Kethrevi watched as the human sat there surrounded by 4 of the deadliest creatures on Velathos Prime, scratching and petting them as if they were harmless pets. The gliders showed no aggression at all. Their venom sacs remained sealed. Their wings stayed folded in relaxation. They were purring. Kethrevi had studied venomous gliders for 15 years, and he had never heard of them purring. He had never heard of them allowing any creature to touch them. He had never heard of anything like what he was seeing right now. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, his voice shaking, "I think we need to run some tests." "On me or on them?" Alina asked. "Both," Kethrevi replied, "definitely both." Alina shrugged, careful not to disturb the gliders on her shoulders. "Okay," she agreed, "but can we do it later? I want to watch the sunset with my new friends." The glider in her lap yawned, showing tiny teeth that could deliver a fatal bite, and then it snuggled deeper against Alina's stomach. Kethrevi sat down heavily on the ground, his legs no longer able to support him. He had no idea what was happening. He had no idea how this was possible. All he knew was that humans were even stranger than the stories suggested, and that this mission was going to be very different from anything he had expected. The laboratory tent buzzed with activity as Kethrevi ran test after test on the samples he had collected. His 4 arms moved constantly, operating multiple instruments at once while his eyes darted between screens filled with data. The results made no sense. He ran the tests again. The results still made no sense. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself, his scales flickering through a dozen colors as his emotions shifted from confusion to disbelief and back again. On the other side of the camp, Alina sat in a folding chair outside her tent, with all 4 gliders arranged around her like a living blanket. She had a small comb in her hand and was carefully grooming the fur of the creature in her lap, working out tiny tangles with patient, gentle strokes. "You are such a good girl," she cooed. "Such a pretty girl with such beautiful wings." The glider made a sound of pure contentment. The Kelix botanist watched from a safe distance, her fur standing straight up with nerves. "She has been doing that for 3 hours, she whispered to one of the Yanari geologists. "How is she still alive?" "I do not know," the Yanari replied, all 3 of their bodies trembling slightly, "but I am not going to ask." Kethrevi emerged from the laboratory tent, with a data pad clutched in 2 of his hands. His scales had settled into a deep purple color that the others had never seen before, a shade that apparently represented complete scientific bafflement. "I have the results," he announced. Alina looked up from her grooming with interest. "Oh good, what did you find?" Kethrevi walked toward her, stopping at what he considered a safe distance, which was about 10 meters away from the nearest glider. "The first discovery is about your biochemistry," he began, reading from his notes. "Human neural receptors are completely incompatible with the protein structure of glider venom." "What does that mean?" Alina asked. "It means the venom cannot affect you," Kethrevi explained. "Your nervous system does not have the right shape for the toxin to attach to, so it simply passes through your body without doing any damage." Alina grinned and scratched the glider under its chin. "Did you hear that, Mango? I am venom-proof." Kethrevi blinked. "Mango. That is her name," Alina said, pointing to the glider in her lap, "because her colors remind me of a ripe mango from Earth." She pointed to the glider on her left shoulder. "This one is Peaches, because she is soft and fuzzy like a peach." Then she pointed to the one on her right shoulder. "This is Dr. Bitey." Kethrevi felt his scales flicker with alarm. "Has that one bitten you?" "No, never," Alina laughed. "But she looks like she is thinking about it sometimes, so I named her that as a joke." She reached up to pat the 4th glider, the one sitting on top of her head like a strange glowing hat. And this magnificent creature is Lord Fluffington the Destroyer." The glider on her head chirped proudly, as if it approved of the title. Kethrevi stared at the human for a long moment, trying to process what he was hearing. "You named the deadly venomous creatures," he said flatly. "Of course I did," Alina replied. "They are my friends now, and friends have names." Kethrevi decided to move on before his brain broke completely. "The second discovery is even more interesting," he continued, looking back at his data pad. "Your body temperature and certain chemicals in your skin produce a very specific combination of signals." "What kind of signals?" "The same signals that were produced by a species called the Velathi, who lived on this planet approximately 12,000 years ago." Alina tilted her head with curiosity, and Lord Fluffington the Destroyer tilted with her. "Who were the Velathi?" "They were the symbiotic partners of the venomous gliders," Kethrevi explained, his voice filled with wonder despite his fear. "The two species lived together in harmony for millions of years, with the Velathi providing warmth and grooming while the gliders provided protection from predators." He looked at the creatures surrounding Alina, seeing them with new eyes. "The Velathi went extinct 12,000 years ago due to a climate shift, and since then, the gliders have been alone." Alina's expression softened with sadness. "They have been alone for 12,000 years. "Yes." She looked down at Mango in her lap, at Peaches and Dr. Bitey on her shoulders, at Lord Fluffington the Destroyer on her head. "No wonder they came to me," she said quietly. "They were lonely." The gliders seemed to sense her emotions, and they pressed closer to her, their bioluminescence pulsing in slow, calming patterns. Tivik, the youngest member of the expedition, had been watching from nearby. He was a small Fenari with large ears and nervous eyes, and he had been terrified of the gliders since the moment they arrived. But now he stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "Dr. Vasquez," he asked hesitantly, "how did you know the gliders would not kill you?" Alina looked at him with a gentle smile. "I did not know," she admitted. Tivik's ears flattened against his head. "You did not know, then why did you touch them?" Alina was quiet for a moment, her hand still stroking Mango's soft fur. "When I was a child on Earth," she said slowly, "I found a stray dog in the streets near my home." The aliens listened with confusion, not knowing what a dog was. "A dog is a predator," Alina explained. "They have sharp teeth and strong jaws, and they can bite very hard, and this particular dog was scared and hungry and had been hurt by other humans." She smiled at the memory. "Everyone told me not to touch it, that it would bite me, that it was too dangerous." "What did you do?" Tivik asked. "I sat down on the ground and I held out my hand and I waited." Alina looked at the gliders around her, her eyes full of warmth. "The dog came to me eventually, and it sniffed my hand, and then it let me pet it, and it became my best friend for 15 years. She shrugged. "I learned something that day about fear and loneliness and trust." "What did you learn?" Kethrevi asked, genuinely curious despite himself. Alina met his eyes. "I learned that sometimes the most dangerous creatures are just waiting for someone to be kind to them." The camp was quiet. The gliders purred. Kethrevi looked at the humans sitting there covered in deadly predators, and for the first time, he thought he understood something important about her species. They were not stupid. They were not reckless. They simply saw the universe differently than everyone else. Where other species saw danger, humans saw possibility. Where other species saw monsters, humans saw friends waiting to be made. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. Kethrevi sat down on a nearby rock, keeping his distance from the gliders, but no longer feeling the desperate urge to run. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, "I think humanity is going to change the galaxy in ways none of us expected." Alina laughed and kissed the top of Mango's fuzzy head. "We usually do," she agreed. Lord Fluffington the destroyer chirped from her head, and somewhere in the jungle, more gliders began to glow in response, their lights appearing one by one like stars being born in the darkness between the trees. The storm came without warning on the 14th day of the expedition. One moment the sky was clear and bright, and the next moment black clouds rolled over the mountains like a living wave, swallowing the sun and plunging the jungle into premature darkness. "Everyone back to camp," Kethrevi shouted over the rising wind, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "Leave the equipment, just move." The team scattered through the forest, running for the safety of their reinforced tents. But half of them had been working in the eastern sector, cataloging a newly discovered cave system, and the storm cut them off before they could return. Kethrevi found himself trapped at the bottom of a steep ravine with Tivik and two of the Yanari geologists. The rain poured down in sheets so thick they could barely see each other. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, and the thunder shook the ground beneath their feet. "We need to find shelter," Tivik cried, his large ears pressed flat against his skull. "The ravine will flood." He was right. Already the water was rising around their ankles, pouring down from the slopes above in muddy streams. Kethrevi spotted a shallow cave in the ravine wall, barely large enough for the four of them. "There," he pointed, "everyone inside." They scrambled into the cave just as the flood waters surged past, transforming the ravine floor into a raging river. Kethrevi pressed himself against the back wall, his heart's pounding, his scales shifting rapidly through colors of fear and relief. They were safe for now. But then he heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, almost lost beneath the noise of the storm. Then it grew louder, deeper, closer. And then the creature appeared at the mouth of the cave. The thornback stalker was enormous, easily 10 meters from snout to tail, its body covered in sharp bony plates that glistened with rain. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness, and when it opened its mouth, Kethrevi could see rows of teeth as long as his forearm. The Yanari screamed. Tivik fainted. Kethrevi reached for his emergency beacon with shaking hands, knowing it would not matter, knowing help could never arrive in time. The stalker stepped into the cave entrance, blocking any hope of escape. It lowered its massive head and sniffed the air, and a hungry rumble built in its chest. Kethrevi closed his eyes and thought of his home world. And then he heard a voice. "Hey, over here, you big ugly lizard." His eyes snapped open. Alina stood on a ledge above the cave entrance, rain streaming down her face, her hair plastered to her skin, a flashlight in one hand and an emergency flare in the other. The four gliders clung to her pack, their bioluminescence blazing so bright they looked like stars fallen from the sky. "Alina, no," Kethrevi screamed, "run." But the human did not run. She jumped down from the ledge and landed between the stalker and the cave, putting herself directly in the path of the massive predator. The stalker turned its attention to her, its yellow eyes narrowing with interest. This new prey was small and weak, and had no armor or weapons. An easy meal. It took a step toward her. Alina raised her flare and ignited it, filling the ravine with harsh red light. "You do not want to do this," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the rain and the wind and the monster standing before her. The stalker hesitated, confused by the light and the fire and the strange, fearless behavior of this tiny creature. And then the gliders moved. Mango launched herself from Alina's pack and flew directly at the stalker's face, her wings spread wide, her bioluminescence flashing in rapid, aggressive patterns. Peaches and Dr. Bitey followed, taking positions on either side of the predator, their small bodies glowing like angry fireflies. Lord Fluffington, the destroyer, rose above them all, hovering in the rain like a tiny, vengeful god, and let out a cry that echoed through the ravine. The stalker froze. It knew the gliders. Every creature on Velathos Prime knew the gliders, and knew to fear them. But these gliders were not behaving normally. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were standing their ground around the human, forming a protective formation that the stalker had never seen before. And then they did something that Kethravi would remember for the rest of his life. The four gliders tilted back their heads and released their venom into the air. Not as a bite, not as a targeted attack, but as a fine mist that spread through the ravine like glowing fog. It was a defense mechanism that had never been documented. A last resort that the gliders had not used in 12,000 years, not since their Velathi partners had lived and fought beside them. The venom mist hit the stalker's eyes and nose and mouth. The massive predator roared in pain and confusion, stumbling backward, clawing at its face with its front legs. It could not see. It could not smell. It could not hunt. Alina did not move from her position. She stood there with her flare held high, watching as the blinded stalker retreated into the storm, crashing through the undergrowth and disappearing into the darkness. Only when the sound of its footsteps had faded completely did Alina let out a long, shaky breath. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the wet ground. The gliders immediately surrounded her, pressing their warm bodies against her cold skin, their bioluminescence shifting to soft, soothing colors. "Good bobbies," Alina whispered, her voice exhausted but proud. "Such brave good bobbies." Kethravi stumbled out of the cave, stepping carefully over the still unconscious Tivik. He stared at the human lying on the ground, covered in deadly creatures that had just saved all their lives. "You could have died," he said, his voice hollow with shock. Alina laughed weakly. "Probably," she admitted. "Why did you come back? The camp was safe, you could have stayed there." Alina lifted her head and looked at him with tired but fierce eyes. "Because you are my crew," she said simply. "I do not leave my crew behind." The gliders chirped in agreement. The storm began to fade, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle, the thunder rolling away into the distance. Rescue teams arrived an hour later, finding the survivors huddled together at the mouth of the cave. They found Alina unconscious from exhaustion, with 4 venomous gliders curled around her like guardian angels, refusing to let anyone approach until they were certain she was being helped and not harmed. Kethravi watched as the medical team carefully lifted Alina onto a stretcher, and he noticed that Lord Fluffington, the destroyer, had positioned herself on Alina's chest, riding along like a small, fluffy protector. He had studied alien species his entire life. He had thought he understood how the universe worked. But humans, he realized now, were something entirely different. Something wonderful. Something terrifying. And something the galaxy was going to have to learn to live with. 1 month after the incident in the ravine, the research station Horizon's Edge had transformed into something no one could have predicted. The common areas were filled with soft glowing lights that moved and played through the corridors at all hours. Venomous gliders had taken up residence in the station, drawn by the presence of Alina and the warmth of the environmental systems. At first, the other species on board had been terrified. They had locked themselves in their quarters and refused to come out, certain that death waited for them around every corner. But days passed and no one was attacked. The gliders simply floated through the halls, curious and gentle, occasionally landing on surfaces to rest or to watch the aliens go about their business. Slowly, carefully, the crew began to relax. They learned that the gliders would not harm anyone who did not threaten them. They learned that the creatures were actually quite social and enjoyed company. They learned that a glider sitting on your shoulder was not a death sentence, but rather a sign of trust and affection. Kethravi sat in his office, staring at the screen in front of him with 2 of his 4 hands, while the other 2 held cups of calming tea. He had been working on his official report for the Galactic Xenobiology Council for 3 weeks now, and he still did not know how to explain what had happened. How do you tell the most respected scientific body in the galaxy that everything they knew about venomous gliders was wrong? How do you explain that a human had tamed the untamable simply by being kind? He took a sip of tea and began typing again. The events of this expedition have revealed several previously unknown facts about both venomous gliders and the human species, he wrote. First, regarding gliders, these creatures are not the mindless predators we believed them to be. They are highly intelligent, socially complex beings who have spent 12,000 years mourning the loss of their symbiotic partners. They do not attack out of aggression, but out of fear and loneliness. When presented with a being who shows them kindness and triggers their ancient bonding instincts, they respond with loyalty and affection that rivals any domesticated species in the galaxy. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Second, regarding humans, this species continues to defy our understanding. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached the gliders with no certainty that she would survive. When asked why she took such a risk, she stated that the creatures looked lonely. This reasoning, which most species would consider suicidal madness, appears to be a fundamental aspect of human psychology. They do not assess danger the way other species do. They see a venomous predator and ask, but is it friendly? They see loneliness in creatures built to kill. Their survival instinct appears to be fundamentally broken, or perhaps more advanced than we understand. Kethrevi leaned back in his chair, his scales shifting to a thoughtful blue. A soft chirp made him look up. A young glider had entered his office through the ventilation system and was now perched on the corner of his desk, watching him with large, curious eyes. 2 months ago, he would have screamed and fled the room. Now he simply nodded at the creature and returned to his work. My recommendation to the council is as follows, he continued typing. Never tell a human something is too dangerous to touch. They will take it as a challenge. Or worse, an invitation. He saved the document and stretched his arms, all 4 of them crackling with the release of tension. Through his office window, he could see the shuttle bay where a transport ship was being loaded for departure. Elena stood near the loading ramp, surrounded by crew members who had come to say goodbye. She had been reassigned to a new mission on the volcanic moon of the Raxus 7, where aggressive silicon-based life forms had been attacking mining operations. It was considered one of the most dangerous postings in the sector. Elena had volunteered for it. Kethrevi made his way down to the shuttle bay, passing through corridors filled with floating gliders who chirped greetings as he walked by. The creatures had become so common that he barely noticed them anymore. They were simply part of life on the station now, small glowing companions who brought light to the darkness between the stars. He found Elena loading the last of her equipment onto the transport. She wore her traveling clothes and a backpack that seemed to move slightly on its own. Dr. Vasquez, he called out. She turned and smiled when she saw him. Kethrevi, I was hoping you would come say goodbye. He stopped in front of her, his scales shifting to a warm green that he had recently learned was the Selthari equivalent of fondness. I wanted to thank you, he said, for everything you have done here. I did not do anything special, Elena replied. I just made some friends. As if on cue, 4 familiar shapes emerged from her backpack. Mango, Peaches, Dr. Bitey, and Lord Fluffington. The destroyer crawled out onto her shoulders and head, taking up their usual positions. Kethrevi blinked in surprise. They are going with you. Of course, Elena said, reaching up to scratch Lord Fluffington under the chin. They are my crew now, and I do not leave my crew behind. The gliders chirped happily. But the Raxus 7 is extremely hostile, Kethrevi protested. The silicon creatures there are violent and territorial and completely unlike anything you have faced before. Elena grinned. I know, she said. I have been reading the reports, and I think I understand why they are so aggressive. Why? Because no one has ever tried being nice to them. Kethrevi opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He had learned over the past month that arguing with humans about this sort of thing was pointless. They would simply do what they believed was right, regardless of the danger, regardless of the odds, regardless of what anyone else thought. I packed extra heat-resistant gloves, Alina added cheerfully. I heard the silicon creatures like belly rubs, but their skin runs about 600 degrees, so I need to be prepared. Who told you they like belly rubs? No one, Alina admitted, but most creatures do, so it seems worth trying. Kethrevi sighed, a sound that had become very familiar over the past weeks. Please try not to die, he said. I always try not to die, Alina replied. I just define acceptable risks differently than most people. She stepped forward and surprised him with a hug, wrapping her arms around his torso while the gliders chirped with approval. Thank you for being my friend, she said quietly, even when you thought I was crazy. I still think you are crazy, Kethrevi replied, but his scales had shifted to bright gold, the color of deep affection. Alina pulled back and walked up the loading ramp, turning at the top to wave. Lord Fluffington, the destroyer, rose from her head and flew in a small circle, bioluminescence flashing in patterns that Kethrevi had learned meant farewell. Then the ramp closed and the transport lifted off, carrying the strange human and her deadly companions toward their next adventure. Kethrevi watched until the ship disappeared among the stars. Around him, the station's resident gliders gathered, their soft glow illuminating the shuttle bay like candles in the darkness. They chirped sadly at the departure of their leader. She will be back, Kethrevi told them, surprising himself with his certainty. Humans always find their way back to the ones they love. The gliders seemed to accept this. They floated away to continue their explorations of the station, leaving Kethrevi alone with his thoughts. He looked out at the stars, wondering what Alina would discover on her new mission. Wondering what other deadly creatures she would befriend. Wondering how the galaxy would change, because one small human had decided to pet something venomous. He smiled, his scales glowing warm and bright. Whatever happened next, it was going to be interesting. And somewhere out there among the stars, Alina Vasquez was already planning her first belly rub attempt on a creature made of living fire. The galaxy would never be the same.